Go on, please. Good evening, friends. So good to see so many of you here again. I think some of you may have seen and heard that there's been some travel delays around. The minute we get kind of an hour of rain, the roads are flooded around Brent Cross. And where do you think half of our audience come from for every event? It's Brent Cross. So what we'll do, our team are going to get all the latecomers in as quietly as we can from the back. But if you're sitting in a row where there are seats in the middle, you might want to shuffle up and leave the seat on the end, but there are plenty more people that are going to come in. So we will get them in as quietly as we can. Thank you for your patience. My name is Raymond Simonson, although I feel like I'm talking to an audience of friends that I've seen many times before, so it's lovely to see you again. I'm very proud and privileged to be the CEO of JW3, which, as I think everybody in the room knows, after almost 10 years since we opened, that we really are the home for Jewish culture and conversation. And actually, in 2 weeks' time, it marks the 10th anniversary of when I first stood on this stage to welcome an invited audience. It was an invite-only audience for our very first event a couple of months before we opened. And on that stage was, and I don't think you were Lord then, were you Lord then 10 years ago?
No,
no,
I wasn't.
Just Daniel, just plain old Daniel Finkelstein then, who was on this stage with the late Rabbi Sachs and Dame Vivian Duffield, our very first event. And Daniel, like Jonathan, is really no stranger to JW3. They are really good friends of JW3. They have a lot more things in common than just that. Both big football supporters of the wrong teams in North London, the wrong teams in London, should I say, although only one of them has taken it far enough to be on the board of Chelsea Football Club, and the chair of the Chelsea Foundation, which football rivalries apart is a wonderful thing to do. So that's great. They are both award-winning journalists. You can both hear them quite often on podcasts, including some of my favourite podcasts, if you like the genre. And about 8-9 months ago, they were sitting here in opposite seats whilst Daniel very kindly interviewed Jonathan for his new book. So we said it was about time to return the favour. So without further ado, two of our favourite friends, I'm going to just call you Daniel and Jonathan. Please give them a...
Thank you, Raymond. Thanks to all of you. In fact, exactly as Raymond says, I have had, it's actually a year to look forward to this event, because it's quite true that a year ago we were sitting more or less in the reverse seating position as Danny was talking to me about my book, The Escape Artist, now in paperback. Those are the last words we're going to say about that, because we are talking about a very special, indeed magnificent book tonight. This book, Hitler, Stalin, Mum and Dad, a family memoir of miraculous survival. Dan, it's the story of your parents, your grandparents. There's so many different questions that this throws up. I'm really looking forward to diving into all of them. There's going to be time for your questions as well. But I thought it will make most sense, the conversation we're going to have, if people know the basic outline. We don't want to give away everything that's in the book. Incredibly, for a family memoir, it is a story with twists and turns that the reader will not see coming. But let's just get the basic sort of facts sorted. So there are, if you like, that many more, but two distinct miracles in the story. Let's start with each one. In fact, why don't we do it this way around? Why don't we start with the story of your mother? So we know just from the title there is a miraculous survival there. So what is that story?
Yeah, so my mother was the daughter of a man called Alfred Weiner, who came back from the First World War in 1919. He'd served on the front, he'd almost died. And he came back to a Jewish community which was actually quite optimistic about its prospects. It had taken in Berlin some of the leading cultural positions. Economically, things looked potentially quite good for the community, despite all the problems in Germany. And he was immediately much more pessimistic than his contemporaries. And in 1919, he writes a tract called Towards Pogroms, ? And he predicted that unless something was done, people would talk to his descendants about bestial murder of Jews. And I think he has some claim to be one of the first people to see what was happening in Germany, and becomes part of an organization called the Zentralverein, which was the group of Germans of Jewish faith and it was the largest communal body. And he spends the 1920s and early 1930s doing things like suing Julius Streicher, the editor of Die Stürmer. He addresses public meetings, trying to tell them about the danger of the Nazis. They're often deny libels against Jews. These meetings are often broken up. He's heckled. He spends a lot of his time on the road doing that. And of course, as we know, I mean, there's lots more to this story. It ultimately fails. And there's an immensely poignant moment where he confronts. He goes to the Reichschancellery and confronts von Papen, who's the Reichschancellor, his main aide, and says, you really need to. You mustn't have a deal with Hitler, and you need to try to get him not to agitate against the Jews. And he gets this response, I've spoken to Hitler in the last few days. He's completely against agitation against the Jews, and he's basically a decent person.
Idealistic.
Idealistic, if a little excitable. That was what this person actually said. And interestingly enough, that person later dies in the July plot against Hitler. My grandfather, as part of this work, creates an archive, which is an archive of everything the Nazis say, pictures of their main proponents, recording what kind of uniforms they wear, recording what different views that they have. And in 1933, when the Nazis come to power, he's failed to prevent them. It's obvious that Goering, who confronts him in a meeting, knows about his archives, tells him to destroy it, and he has to get out of Germany. And just at that point, my mother is born. So everything that I've told you happens before June the 10th, 1933. So it was my mother's 90th birthday on the weekend. She was unfortunately no longer alive to enjoy it. But she was born on June the 10th, 1933, just as my grandfather is balanced between Germany and Holland, which is where they go. And my mother spends her youth in Holland, relatively happy, with a lot of other German Jews in the community, which you'll know would include the Frank family, whom they knew because they were part of the same synagogue. And ultimately, Alfred takes the library to London to help what then turns into the war effort. And they think Holland will be safe because it's neutral. But unfortunately, they're not right about that. Holland's invaded, they're trapped. And then the rest of the story, I explain how it was that my mother, I won't tell you now, we may come to this in a minute, but how it was that my mother, who then goes to Westerbork, goes to Belsen rather than to Sobibor or Auschwitz. And we were talking about Jonathan's, I know that he said this is about my book, Jonathan's, by the way, if you haven't read it, amazing book. And funnily enough, these fit together. The one thing in the Holocaust or in what the Soviets did in the war that is not in my book is Auschwitz. Family went to Sobibor, they went to Westerbork, they went to Belsen, they went to the Gulag, they went to Uzbekistan, they went to Iran, they went to Palestine, they were in Lvov. The one place they did not go to was Auschwitz. So our books fit together in that way. But my mother is saved both from the gas chambers and then ultimately even from Belsen by becoming a citizen of Paraguay. And she was basically the beneficiary of an extraordinary scheme by a group of Polish diplomats to create, they're not false, these passports, they're real, but they have a lie in the middle of them, which is that my mother is Paraguayan, but she was not. And everyone knows that she's not Paraguayan. The Germans know. The Allies know, the Paraguayans certainly know, my mother obviously knew that too. But they gave them exchange value, and Himmler was wanting to exchange Jews, and he used Belsen to do that. Almost nobody gets exchanged. I had difficulty finding the story of my mother's exchange because so few people were exchanged. But 136 of them, in all the millions that died, in all the tens of thousands of people who died in Belsen, did go on an exchange, and my mother and her sisters and her mother were 4 of those 136. And so if you want to have a miraculous survival, my mother was a citizen of Paraguay, I think constitutes. That's a miracle.
Completely. And it is miraculous. And needle in a haystack kind of numbers. I mean, as you've explained, we will come back to some of the detail of that, and particularly the figure of your grandfather and the legacy of that for you, and there's much to say. But there are 2 stories. The other story is the one about your father, and it touches on a whole area that is talked about much, much less, which we'll get onto why it's talked about much less, but just give us that miracle.
Yeah, absolutely. So whilst my mother's is an extraordinary story, but as part of a story probably most people here will be aware of in a fair amount of detail, but nevertheless it's astonishing. My father is actually, his story is a completely bog standard version of something most people don't know anything about, which was the attempt by Stalin to destroy the whole of the Polish governing class by imprisoning the leaders and deporting all of their families, hundreds of thousands of people. My grandfather was such a wealthy merchant in Lvov, which is now Lviv, that he was known as the Iron King. He had this immense business. He'd inherited it and expanded it. And in 1939, when the Germans invade from one part of Poland, the other way come the Russians, and they actually, what nobody knows at that point, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact has divided the country, and Lvov had fell into the Russian part of the treaty, and they take over Lvov, and the first thing that they do is to arrest some of the direct political people directly running the city, but they've also got a plan to arrest everybody who has even the slightest responsibility, so head teachers, people who have been involved in any political organisation, people who lead any religious organisation, philatelists, because they have got international contacts, people who speak Esperanto. My grandfather did not speak Esperanto, didn't collect stamps, but he was a city councillor, and he was also a Jewish leader on the city council. So for those, and a successful businessman. So he was arrested, and eventually he was accused in interrogation of strengthening the might of capitalist Poland, which he most certainly did, and he ultimately is sentenced to 8 years in the Gulag. When he's arrested, the rest of my family don't know where he's gone. So my grandmother goes to the prosecutor's office to find out what's happened to her husband, who's been taken away, and they say, well, we'll tell you, but in 4 days' time, come back. And after 3 days, they arrested all of the families, including them. So my father at the age of 10 and my grandmother and my great-grandmother are put onto a cattle truck, and this cattle truck heads off into what's known as Siberia. It was in fact Kazakhstan, but Kazakhstan on the borders of Siberia, where they then are spend the winter. First of all, the summer farming, which my grandmother was not a farmer, let's put it that way, and then she nor am I, but she really? And then the winter comes and they end up in this self-made hut made of cow dung, which was below freezing inside because they had no fuel and they had almost no food except some provisions that were sent to them from Lvov, hard fought, and some of it which was sent to them arrived. Because one thing that's important to understand, my grandfather was a prisoner. They were not prisoners. They were just, it was sort of Soviet leveling up, right? They're going to populate the interior with these people. They were all going to become part of a new working class. And so it's obvious to my grandmother and my father that if they stay there any longer, they will die. They didn't die in the first winter. They will die in the second or third winter. That just looks obvious. And at that point, Hitler invades the Soviet Union. This was a disaster for all the Jews of Lvov, but it saved my father's life. So I won't sort of tell you too much detail about exactly how that all panned out, but my father eventually came here with the Polish Resettlement Corps in 1947.
But again, there's a miracle there, because the grinding poverty that you describe in Siberia, in quotes, but Kazakhstan, where they are sleeping, basically is like a sort of animal shelter. It's not as low than that. Yeah. And you have this image, which is very enduring, of there is so little food that your grandmother puts the few fragments of bread in a bag that is hung from the ceiling, so it's out of reach of your father. Your father's a child. I mean, a young child. My
father and rats. Those are the two reasons why it's hung from the ceiling. But there are circumstances in which he gets to eat the contents of the bag. So that, but yes, they one of the things that I think is extraordinary, they have no fuel, and ultimately, when the winter's over, they did have a tiny bit of food, but the problem was there was nothing to cook it with. My father realised that there was some way of creating a little bit of heat, which was to take copies of the history of the Communist Party in Kazakhstan, written in Kazakh, which had been provided to the village by the Soviet commissars, and which nobody in the village was interested in having. And he discovered that if he lit one, which was hard, but if he did light one, it would last long enough to heat a pot of sort of gruel, and that's one of the ways that he survived. So it did have a socialist solution in the end.
So, in a way, the question is not about how they survived, because they were children, they were dependent on their parents or others who could help them. But this question that comes up a lot with survivors of the Holocaust particularly, but let's put it in both their cases, very often they're asked, how did you manage to survive? Did you have some special strength or quality? And in my experience, Holocaust survivors very frequently answer just with one word, which is luck, is their answer. But in this case, was there some special strength in your grandparents? Was it luck? Was it both? Because miraculous is a very interesting word to use, a quasi-religious word. So what's your answer?
So there are a number. I think that it was a combination of two things, one of which undoubtedly was luck. When you realise how they have had the Paraguayan passports, or the fact that it worked for them, luck was a very big part of that. The fact that the circumstances in which they get released from this place, which my grandmother called the island of hunger and death, that was also luck. But at the centre of the book are two incredibly strong women, both my grandmothers. When I was growing up with Lucia, Greta I did not know, but Lucia I did, and Lucia, she was incredibly loving granny, but I also did notice that when her friends would call, and she thought they were being boring, she would put the phone down on the bed, right, the receiver, and then go off and make a cup of coffee. She was totally, and we were going, Granny, she's on the phone. Totally uninterested in that. And also, I do remember also that when I was campaigning for a political party in my neighbourhood, and somebody came up to me and said, oh, we've just come across a voter who won't vote for us because of our candidate's silly hairstyle. I knew it was Granny immediately. So she was like very tough, and she, through sheer willpower, she I think does play a big role in saving my father. Greta's role in saving my mother was more direct. I think she gave them her food. I think she did that. So I think it was luck and two incredibly strong women, which are two great things in life, I think.
Yeah. There's we could talk a lot about the method of how you did it, and I'm only going to do that once, one question on that, because there's tons to ask about it, but others may have questions. One thing that comes clear reading it is this isn't just sort of family anecdote and stories that have been passed down. This is rigorously researched and grounded in the documentary record. Right. You have evidence for everything that's there. It's not just sort of family mythology. Often it begins with the family story you've told, but then you check it out and you get the record. So among the documents you've got letters that Lucia receives, even though she's there in the middle of metaphorical Siberia. You've got a diary one of your mother's siblings wrote in Belsen. Again, a surprise if you think people in those camps couldn't have put pen to paper. You've even got granular detail in your father's time on the collective farm, etc. How were you able to have this documentary?
So I think one of the things, everybody's contribution to the literature is different. So let's take, for example, Philippe Sand's amazing book, East West Street, and you can read that book, particularly if you've got part of your family come from Louvain and think to yourself, there's nothing more to write now. I can't write anything after that. That's too brilliant, and I can't. And then I thought, well, actually, one of the reasons Philippe writes about these other great figures is because he doesn't, in fact, not know, as indeed do I not know, about a particular kind of person, which is people whom the Nazis shot in Poland, some of which are very difficult to trace, and I don't succeed in doing that either. But what I do have is this unbelievable abundance of evidence. So first of all, the Association of Jewish Refugees did these long interviews with my father and my mother. I might have been able to write my mother's story, which had some other documentation, without that. My father's story, if Bea Lefkowitz of the AJR had not done what she did, and has done it for other people, by the way, as an immense service to history, I wouldn't have been able to write this book.
Just on that one point, because you acknowledge her in the book, Bea Lefkowitz of the Association of Jewish Refugees interviewed your father 4 hours long. I found myself thinking, how come you haven't done that yourself?
No, it's worse than that. I didn't actually. So I did. Okay, so I didn't even know that this existed. This interview, and I went to the Wiener Library to show my children my grandfather's library, and they happened to have a refugee exhibition. I put these headphones on, and there was 2 minutes of my father. I said, "Oh, that's fantastic." To Ben Barco, the head of the library, please send it to me. And he sent it to me. I thought, oh, 2 minutes of my dad, that's great. But I've just heard it, so I put it in the drawer. And about 6 months later, I thought it'd be nice to hear those dad's voice again. So I put it out, I put it in the CD player, and it doesn't play. I'm really irritated. You probably had this experience. Couldn't they copy it properly? Anyway, so I take it out, and I look at it, and it says DVD. And it's only then that I put it in a DVD player. And my father came on the screen. I realized it's 4 hours of my father talking. I didn't know that he'd done it, actually. Maybe he mentioned it to me, but I don't think so. So I had interviewed my father, and I'd noted the interview, but I hadn't videoed it. And the texture of that, the sheer amount of detail of it, the questions that she was intelligent enough to and perceptive enough to have asked, just made that a record of a wholly different order. Yeah. But then there was a bag of letters, as you said. It's one thing having German letters. Polish letters are a whole different thing. And I couldn't even... So with some... Let's, for example, my grandfather had 26 pieces of correspondence with Otto Frank. Okay, but it turned out that most of those pieces of correspondence didn't really merit translation because they were, I've sent you a copy of this book and I've bought this copy and I'll see you on the 3rd of October, that sort of thing. So, but I discovered that by typing it into Google Translate, and I knew what it was, and then I didn't need to translate it further. I couldn't do that with these Polish letters because I couldn't even read them. Yeah. They were tiny, spidery writing, and they'd all been in this bag for years, and obviously they'd been all the way across the Soviet Union into Siberia and kept in a
Because the point is, she had kept them, even though she had nothing, she held on to these
She
fragments.
kept these 90 letters, and they're an amazing record of... And then after, she then resumes correspondence. So there's then even more detailed correspondence in the Soviet Union after the amnesty. So that was an amazing amount of... And then there was all my grandfather's archive in the library. So as I say, his discussions with Otto Frank, his discussions with Jim Callahan, his report of what the Centralverein and the body that he did doing. There were newspaper cuttings. My grandfather had obituaries in every newspaper in the world. The Wiener Library had its bulletins. So there were lots I could find. But I was very fortunate on my father's side, because that was more hard going to find that evidence. But I was just I thought to myself, the thing that can be original about this book is to write a book about your parents and really know in a lot of detail what happened to them. And therefore, I really pushed that and went to the element to get that.
So I promised that I would do this to go back specifically, and you just mentioned him, to your maternal grandfather, Alfred Wiener, because he, in a way, stands alone in the story, because the others are interacting with each other, but because of what you told us about, he goes to London and then New York, etc. He does stand alone. He's also, a public figure, and as you've said, part of the historical record. This thing you began with, he comes back from the war in 1919, seized of this notion that the country I am proudly a patriot veteran of is on its way to, as you quoted, bestial murder of Jews. Almost nobody saw that in 1919, 1920. So what's your account of how he had this extraordinary and rare, and in the end correct, insight into where his country was going?
In fact, he has two insights. So one thing was this amazing knowledge that this was coming to Jews. The second is, in the sort of 25, 26, he begins to focus on Hitler and Hitler as a particular... And he actually doesn't succeed in persuading his other colleagues. There's a big far-right movement, but Hitler is the most important person in it. He is telling them that, and they don't actually believe him. The reason he sets up his archive is it's a sort of compromise. They kind of go, well, okay, if you insist, we'll at least fund this archive. And he does then create the archive that then ultimately is destroyed, but starts again and becomes the Wiener Library. It's an interesting question, but I don't know what it was about him that made him work this out. I think he felt very passionately about being German, and he asserted above all other things that as a Jew he was a German. It leads him into a fight with the Zionists. So one of the things I say, record, is one of his best-selling books actually was A Critical Journey Through Palestine. He goes on a journey with my grandmother through Palestine, and he sort of says, this place isn't big enough for all of us. Essentially his view was, we don't want to live there. We live here. It's miles to the nearest deli if you live there, and and I don't want to live with Germans. And this is not a solution. And he's also, this is interesting from my point of view. He's like my grandmother. Both of them, their politics was resolutely anti-utopian. I know this is an interesting thing. I know I would have made the same. What was effectively an error, and I would have made the same one. I know it because I can understand my own politics well enough to perceive that. But anyway, he is anti-utopian, so he doesn't like the fact that all these kibbutzes require them to are trying to sort of have an experiment in which they abolish capitalism and have
remake
a homeland
human
for the Jews.
nature.
And it's not, and he sort of draws all these maps showing it's not big enough. I think it's one of the reasons he ends up having a nervous breakdown in 1940, partly it's his family's, in 1933, partly it's, having to leave the country, and partly it's because he kind of was wrong. But truthfully, when you read it, you think it was only half wrong, because the other thing he was saying was, if you go there, you'll never have peace, because he was an Arabic scholar and he felt there were already people living there and they wouldn't ever settle with them. And that's also been true. So the great tragedy for the Jews is they were both having an argument about what was a safe future for the Jews, both of them suggesting different methods, and neither of them were right. And that's a problem.
On that, there's a quote which I want to put to you, because you restrain yourself tremendously in the book from concurrent commentary and polemic. It's about then, it's a story. But every now and again, there's a little flash of commentary on the now, which is, after all, your day job in the Times. And you say this: the greater Jewish tragedy, this is exactly in the context of what you just said, the greater Jewish tragedy is that as Jews argued over which solution could long guarantee peace, security, and acceptance, history would reveal that none of them could. And then you add, none of them can.
I smile because when I promise you this is true. When I wrote that half sentence, I thought about the fact that we would one day sit on this stage and talk about it.
Did you? Did you really?
Yes. It's so incredibly funny that you picked that up. I wrote that especially for you. I think it is. I think the great tragedy for Jewish people is. Here are these two people are having this argument, and we always assume, well, one of them must be right, And in many ways, my grandfather, for example, thought. He wasn't sure about this because he could see the energy that was going into it, but he wondered whether Tel Aviv would ever be economically successful. He wasn't to anticipate that, yes, they'd be able to fit the Jews into Israel because the Nazis would kill so many Jews. But the part in which he says, we'll have this constant war with the people who live there, that was also true. So both sides of them were correct. And I think it does make a powerful case. Amos Oz puts it in that brilliant way about, which is he spent his whole life with people saying Jews go to Palestine, and then now is going around on the walls as Jews get out of Palestine.
Yeah, but in a way, the bit that surprises me is not the pessimism about Zionism in that sentence. It's more the pessimism about diaspora life in Hendon Central, Pinner, and so on, which you've written very sort of poetically about and movingly about, that this moderate solution is the one that will give us safety. So that none of them can.
Yes.
What pulled me up short about it was not that you were saying Israel's not going to be safe, I get that. It was that you're saying you're not necessarily safe here, and I wondered about that.
Donald Trump might well win the presidency of the United States, with all that would mean, for example, for the Ukraine war. We're currently engaged in, for the first time in 300 years, the Prime Minister of the country has had to resign from Parliament for lying to Parliament, and is defending himself by quitting Parliament and trying to get others to do the same thing. In those circumstances, while I I'm not saying we're in the same, you can read this book and realize it would be hysterical to suggest we're in anywhere nearly the same situation now. But certainly, I begin the book by saying, am I as confident as I would have been 15 years ago? I'm not, no.
And the events of the last few years have done that to you. I mean, I'm thinking of the Corbyn period and other things.
Of course, yeah, the Corbyn period, but also not just on the left, but also, it's very important for someone who's on the centre right like me to say there's also a threat on the right, absolutely.
Yeah, and we will come back to that specifically, I think. You write both stories powerfully, your mother's experience, your father's experience. I detected, and I'm happy to be corrected if you feel it's not there, but I felt in your writing there is a special vehemence about your descriptions of the crimes of communism against your family. There's an extra bitterness and anger in there when you're describing the fate meted out to your father and his parents. And I wondered if what was driving that was in a way to do with your potential reader, which is you felt towards your audience, you don't need me to embellish or provoke anger in you about Belson and Westerbork and so on, but you probably don't know about this, and therefore I'm going to push it harder.
There's an element of that was conscious and an element of that was a bit unconscious. And my son, who was reading it, was constantly trying to make sure. So one of the things that he wants to make sure is you just tell the story. Yeah, at one point, I went off on a digression for 500 words about Hannah Arendt, and he was like, no, you don't need to fight Alfred's battle with Hannah Arendt again because no one knows who she is. And so Alfred got himself into political rows, and sometimes I'd follow him into them, and I realised that was ridiculous. And I want people to read this and think this is an incredible story, and I'm pulled along by the characters, and I'm engrossed in what happens to them, and I wonder what happens next. Not I'm finding myself in an essay class on Eichmann in Jerusalem. So I did try not, However, I definitely was inclined to make sure people understood this crime that they did not know about. And at the end of my parents' life, my mother begins to be asked to do all these talks. She talks to schools, and at one of them, the first one she did, she said to me, in my Hebrew classes, she said to me, "Do you think people will be interested in me saying that I knew Anne Frank?" Which I said I thought they would be quite interested. And she didn't know, she wasn't sure people would be interested. And then she went round and she ended up doing a BBC programme, and George Osborne invited her to 10 Downing Street to meet his kids, and she went to a reception with David Cameron. She told her story to lots of different people, and until she couldn't tell it, anymore. Fortunately, the last one was at my son's school, which was a very moving thing that she did when she was really quite ill by that point. No one ever asked my father to tell his story ever, right? So apart from this video, nobody ever. There was no school program for it. He was not invited to anywhere. Nobody ever asked for him to do that. And my mother always used to tell bits of his story as part of what she said, and the original title of this book was going to be the subtitle, Hitler, Stalin, Mum and Dad, and the title was going to be It's Not a Competition. And I didn't do it in the end because I thought that was a better title.
Yeah.
Good
call.
And I think it was a good call. But my mother used to have this statement, which I liked very much, where, that thing with Diane Abbott, where she starts going through what had happened to African Americans and other people, and I was very keen to focus on the fact that she was right about those things. Where she made a mistake was thinking it was a competition, and it had to be won by somebody, and if it wasn't going to be won by her, it might be won by the Jews, and that was like a big mistake. So I don't want to set up a situation where we start to think who had it worse, what was the worst crime. But I did want people to understand, in pursuit of an abstract idea, which they kind of knew wasn't true. So they realised that my mum, my dad and his mother were not going to move to Kazakhstan in order to help the Soviet economy as part of some socialist inspiration. They'd have to drive them there in a cattle truck at the point of a rifle butt. And yes, I've told that story with a degree of vehemence, but hopefully not ideologically, just so that you get what's happened to them.
But at one point you say, in exactly the passage of the book where you do say how your father was not invited to give talks and so on, you say, every crime the tribunal, referring to Nuremberg, every time Nuremberg had determined the Nazis were guilty of the Soviets, every crime the tribunal had determined the Nazis were guilty of, the Soviets were guilty of that too, you say.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if, for a Jewish audience particularly, that rubs up against something that Jews hold on to quite deeply, which is that there was something special about the Nazi project, about the Jews, and that was its ambition to eliminate the Jews forever.
Okay, so what's interesting is that is true of Nuremberg, but it's not true of the Eichmann trials. So the crimes which Eichmann was hanged for, the Soviets did not commit that crime. And that was unique. The crimes that are included in the Nuremberg judgment weren't really the Holocaust. They were all about they were all about creating a war and a conspiracy to create a war and committing crimes against humanity, but not the attempt to eliminate the whole of a particular ethnic group. However, the Soviets definitely did want to, and said so explicitly. Khrushchev, who is at one point my dad's next door neighbour, tries to, his aim, he says, is that your relatives will disappear from you like field mice, and you'll never see them again. They deliberately attempt to take the leadership of Poland, and that is, it's not the same thing, but it's still a horrendous crime of a similar type, which is an attempt to eradicate a people.
Yeah, but in that case, the Polish leadership.
Yeah.
But is it important to you that these things, there is a phrase used in a very different context, parity of esteem, meaning parity of negative esteem. Is it important to you that we revile Stalin as much as we revile Hitler?
No, because it's not a competition. You can, and that's, so I use that, I think they were both really bad, and just they had somewhat differences, and you can decide how much you decide to revile them. But yes, I think the only important thing there is not that you decide that you want to revile them equally, but simply that you ought to revile Stalin. And that the crimes that he committed, and the Katyn massacre, which we haven't even talked about yet, but that was a cold-blooded murder of 30,000 people, 26,000 people, that he personally signs, and that Beria signs as well. And that is a deliberate attempt to wipe out the whole of the officer class of the Polish.
I'm pushing you just because I want to know if you're one of those people, and it's a legitimate position, that think that it would be at odds with the Jewish view, which is there is something singular, and the singularity needs to be held on to about the Holocaust.
Yeah, there is something singular about it, and there are also a lot of other bad things that also happened, and this is one of them. So, there's a singularity about this as well. That's really my position. So, if you think I'm being a bit evasive, I probably am, and the reason for that is that I don't want to kind of level down, right, these crimes, and to sort of suggest our Holocaust wasn't really, an unbelievable and execrable event that was unique in many aspects. But at the same time, I don't want to, by doing that, excuse what Stalin did, or say that it didn't amount to a different form of horrible, crime, and I suppose genocidal crime, actually.
I just want to ask you about Alfred again, and your grandfather. There's one passage of the book I found really interesting, because he made a series of decisions that meant he was not with his wife and children at crucial moments of peril for them. He was in London and he was in New York, and he made a couple of decisions where he could have been after the war, perhaps, and then wasn't. And you, just at the moment, I'm thinking, am I allowed to sort of take a bit of a dim view of your grandfather? You then say, if anyone ever, you yourself voice sort of worry about the decisions he made, and you say, if ever anybody would judge Alfred to your mother would give a dusty answer, you say.
That's true.
And I wondered whether you yourself give a dusty answer to that question, even when you are the one asking the question.
So I don't want to give different answers to my mum, because mum was great. So interestingly, in that generation, while I was writing this book, there was one person alive, which is my mother's sister Eva, who was in Belsen and had exactly the same experience as my mother. Her husband Ted was still alive until he died during the writing of the book. He was 97 years old, and about 2 or 3 months before he died, actually, it was his birthday, and I rang him on his birthday, and we ended up talking for an hour about all these things. And I knew, and I therefore pushed him, that he was a bit critical of Alfred for one of the things in the book. When he's reunited with the family, he leaves the girls in the United States and has to come back to Britain to save the library, effectively. And the logic of it's very strong, but you read it and think he didn't see them for 2 years. And was that really a correct decision? And I know that Ted was critical of him for that, and also for the fact that he was in London when they were trapped in Amsterdam, which was an incorrect criticism because that was Greta's decision, actually, my grandmother's decision, not his. But the second thing did have some force, and I said, did Eva agree with you? And he went, oh no, she was furious with me when I said this. So the girls simply did not have that view, and I'm a bit reluctant to substitute my own judgment. He does read a bit oddly. It certainly indicates that he was very focused on his work.
Yeah.
But I don't know whether I really want to supplant my emotion over his. So that's one of those things where you can read it and it's left to the reader to.
You did. No, absolutely. You give the sort of material to the reader and then let the reader decide.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's just the business of when one writes about one's own family. It's even if you've given us the reason to have misgivings, you then side with your mum, which I get. So I want to ask some things about you a bit, and that is a theme in the book I wrote, which you referred to very generously. A theme of that book was inherited trauma. That what people who endured these most extreme events could not but help, but in some way transmit the pain to the next generation and the generation after that. It's a phenomenon. It's not an original observation. It's things that people talk about a lot, particularly in the area of the Holocaust. And I look at you and think there is, not just outwardly, chatting, but in everything you write, there is very little sign of that. The position that you're most associated with, in a way, is this sort of optimistic or moderate position, which maybe is not the same as optimistic, actually, but a kind of a moderate position, restrained. Your hymns, your homages to the suburbs and to ordinary life, and the pleasures one can take from going to see a football match or spending time with children, etc. These do not look like somebody who is carrying this trauma, and yet in your case, you had a double inheritance of it. Both of your parents, as young children, went through traumatic experiences. As I say, a lot of people whose parents went through the Holocaust report a kind of inherited trauma. How come you seem, but tell me if I'm wrong, to have evaded that?
So my parents absolutely didn't believe in the second generation. I should put a brackets around this one statement, which is my mother was a very, very sympathetic and an empathetic person. So she would never want to deny anybody else's feeling of that, right? She would be embarrassed to tell someone they didn't feel how they felt. But she didn't feel like that. She didn't want us to feel like that. So she didn't believe that we should be second generation survivors. Indeed, she didn't even really want to define herself as a survivor. So a man called Harry Borden has done an amazing book of photographs of survivors of the Holocaust, and called Survivors, and each of them are asked to write a few lines. And my mother writes, I'm a person and a mother and a teacher and a wife first, and only then a survivor. And that's how she saw herself, and my father as well. He never went back to Lvov. He said to me, the house is there, I'm here, that's better. They looked to the future. They wanted us to do the same thing. They wanted us to consider ourselves to be British. My father could speak 9 languages and effectively sort of discouraged me from learning any. In the school way, he wanted me to get A, obviously, in French and stuff, but he didn't. He wasn't that bothered if I didn't do it, because even though he'd gained a lot of professional advantage from doing it, because he wanted us to sort of look to the future and be British, and they definitely did not want us to inherit from them any feeling of trauma. So my mother even did directly discourage me from going to Auschwitz. But they told us their story, and they didn't hold back from that. Although when I became a journalist, I returned to Mum's story and interviewed her properly, and then was a bit shocked by how bad it had been, because based on the things that she told me before. So she definitely, there was a conscious attempt not to tell us to be open, but to let us live without that trauma and not feel. She felt it would be a victory for Hitler if we then had to live the whole of our life under the shadow of her experience. And she wasn't going to let him spoil her life either, right? You know, and she lived round the corner from Brent Cross Shopping Centre. And you know, I mean, I know that sounds a bit funny, but I think that's how my parents saw it, and they didn't want to. They didn't want it to dominate.
But it totally shaped your politics, and you.
Yes.
Well, let me run this past you. You tell me if it's wrong. But in the sense of thinking, people undervalue and underestimate the preciousness of Brent Cross Shopping Centre and an ordinary life where you're not about to get pogromed and there's not a knock on the door in 3 o'clock.
Completely, it's completely, and that is a dominant thing. And so, and interesting what you said about so I suppose a concern that such a thing might happen as a result of the Nazis is quite common particularly among Jewish people, but among middle-class people, a progressive sentiment. Where I'm slightly unusual is having the same feeling about the far left. Right? So I find lots of people will find the National Front disturbing, but I find the SWP also disturbing in that way. Right?
Because of your grandfather,
and
your father's experience.
because of my parents, because I basically felt that similar things happened to both, not the same, but similar things happened to both of them as a result of these kind of revolutionary overthrow ideologies. And definitely that has been an important part of my politics, and it was part of my parents' politics too.
So, because I was thinking about your two grandfathers, and one was a city councillor, was involved in the public life of his country. There are you, a member of the House of Lords, you're doing that. That's Dolu on one side. And on the other side, you've got this man who is, you know, he's a kind of, in the tradition of the Jewish prophets, he is warning people, desperate for them to hear, traveling around Germany with this suitcase full of Nazi pamphlets. I mean, and not everyone is listening. And even the ones who are listening are not really getting it. And that, to me, is a pessimism, a good pessimism. He's right. And I felt as if in you, there's been less of that, but in recent years, it comes back. We touched on this earlier, but the Alfred Wiener in you lives louder now than it did.
Yeah, definitely. And by the way, you know, one of the things that's interesting in your extraordinary book is people don't want what Alfred was telling them before is what obviously Rudy Verber was telling them after, or when he'd actually seen it with his own eyes, and they didn't want to believe it in either case, inside the Jewish community as well as outside in the broader middle class. So it's quite interesting how people can say, look, I can show you, I've got the protocols of the El Zazan here in my case, and he would kind of lean down and open the case and give them the copy of what Hitler had said, or a cemetery, dossier of cemetery destructions, and people wouldn't actually not imagine it was happening. And, you know, as I say, the person saying to him, Hitler's idealistic, but a bit excitable. So I think there is a correspondence between our accounts there. Yes, there's no doubt that the last 5 years, I've ended up writing somewhat more alarmed articles about, and I'm certainly a part of my politics is to be very concerned about even small steps over legal norms or institutional protections, and to be concerned about populist direct democratic claims, because I think, and the idea that there's a will of the nation. You know, I used to have this thing of saying I don't want a white knight on a charger because I know who's sweeping the nation clean, because I know who's going to be doing the sweeping, and we all know who the swept will be. And the day before yesterday, someone described Boris Johnson as one of his allies, as a knight on a charger. Yeah,
white knight on a charger. I heard exactly the same interview. Just because you mentioned this parallel at this point about Alfred, and actually, and you mentioned Rudy Verber, but just one bit leapt out at me. There's an episode earlier on in the book when a Jewish colleague of Alfred's in the library, could have done more. It's the man whose name begins with Z. You'll know
Zellinger. Zellenziger.
Yeah, I didn't want to risk pronouncing it. Now you know why. He could have done more. we'll just keep it at that. And and there are many cases of that throughout the period of decisions even Jews made, which afterwards we can judge. And you said, again, we'll quote your mother would say, whenever this sort of thing came up, it was the Nazis who were responsible, she would say.
Yeah.
And that's a contrast with the man at the centre of my book, Rudolf Verber, who lived with rage till his dying breath at the decisions of Rezső Kastner, the leader of the Jews of Hungary, who had failed to pass on his warning, as he saw it. And so there's your mother's position, it was the Nazis who were responsible, in a way, end of, sort of thing.
Yeah.
But 30 pages later, you then say, you talk about the decisions of the Jewish Council in Amsterdam, which made decisions to draw up lists and to organize the deportations. And you say of their one of those decisions in particular, it was a grotesque calculation to make, even at the point of a gun.
So you're a very good reader, because those pages are linked, obviously, to each other. And I wrote the one knowing that I was going to come to the other. So my grandfather, when he goes to Holland, he is able to establish this archive, which was of great value to the intelligence services and warned everyone about the war, the Nazi crimes, and recorded everything that the Nazis did. He's only able to do that with the help of a leading Dutch Jew called David Cohen. David Cohen becomes the chairman of the library. David Cohen later tells Alfred he's going to have to leave Amsterdam because the Dutch fear that he's undermining their neutrality. He is a great ally of my grandfather's in the anti-Nazi struggle. David Cohen becomes the chairman of the library, but also the chairman later of the Jewish Council. It's not a biography of David Cohen, so I did not then go into details, but after the war, there are huge criticisms of David Cohen's role. And the truth is nuanced. He unquestionably was vain, and he ignored the warnings that he was given. I don't accept there's a sort of communist critique of him, which is that he was trying to save the upper middle classes. And I think that there's certainly a truth that he felt that they ought to try to save the prominent leadership of the community, because otherwise the community would be eradicated. But he they make these difficult decisions. And one example I give is the yellow stars. So I did not understand about the yellow stars. David Cohen is called in and told everyone's going to have to wear a yellow star, and they're going to have to put it on in 3 days. One of those days is Shabbat, and everyone's going to have to you're going to have to hand these out and sell them to every Jewish family. And if they don't have them on their clothes, they can't leave the house. So then the question is, what was the right thing to do? Yes, if you sewed them on, you were doing the Nazis' work for them. And if the Jewish Council had refused to distribute them, then it would have been very difficult for the Nazis. It would have taken them months. The problem was that Jews couldn't go out until they'd done that. So David Cohen's response to that was, well, if we don't give out these things, people... So they were constantly in this moral dilemma. And my mother was saying, well, people did make mistakes. Zelenziger, as you'll see from the book, he definitely makes a mistake, which possibly leads to his own death and possibly leads to the death of other people who he could have saved. Cohen unquestionably makes moral errors. But my mother also used to have a phrase, it's not in the book, but she used to have a phrase, is the person who breaks the dishes is the person who does the washing up, right? So, if David Cohen had not been the leader of the Jewish community, they wouldn't have had the library, he also wouldn't have been drawn into these moral dilemmas. He makes mistakes, but they were not his fault. Ultimately, they were the fault.
The tension between the two bits I read out is because you yourself do see that you're conflicted by it a bit.
Yeah.
Because there's a bit of you that sides with your mother, don't judge anyone, and another bit that thinks that was a grotesque decision.
100%. A very big element of my politics is two things against each other can be right at the same time, and you constantly have to make choices between them.
And because you mentioned Hannah Arendt before, and she was, of course, scathing about these Jewish
so that's the context in which I was going to write our... So Hannah Arendt was critical of Jewish councils, but also my grandfather clashed with something called the Frankfurt School of communists and socialists in America afterwards. But this is, you'll be relieved to know that
this is the bit you didn't include.
Did not include this, so that I didn't want people to... Mick Jagger once said about Time Out, I don't want to cross a picket line in order to go to the cinema, right? Because he felt that there was like a load of left-wing stuff, and then he got to the what time the film was on. And I also don't want people to have to attend a lecture in order to read the book.
No, absolutely not. So, but just on the thing about your mother's position on it, almost emotionally, this is the thing I wonder. In the case of Rudolf Erbe, it made him very bitter and angry for most of his life, the position he held. And I just wonder if, in a way, it helped your mother to have in a way to not hold that view.
Yeah, I think so.
And just to say the Nazis were responsible and leave it there.
Yeah, my mother didn't want it to dominate her life, and she was just a very unbitter person. And whether or not that is just the interesting thing about Rudy Verba was that what he was like. And
Anyway,
and he just had this thing to hang on to in this big story. Because I think my mother was probably a bit like that anyway. My sister is like that.
Yeah.
And so that's probably just what Mum was like. And then she had this extraordinary thing to deal with and processed it in that way.
So this is going to be the last thing from me before we open it up. There is no way, I think, that anyone could read this book without feeling tremendously moved by the plight of refugees and feel tremendously angry towards those countries who closed their doors to, your ancestors and others. And now we have a Home Secretary who talks about refugees and asylum seekers as an invasion, and who dreams of sending those people, even the desperate ones, to Rwanda, and says that's her big dream, to see a plane take off with them. You're a Conservative member of the House of Lords. Mm-hmm. You have the Conservative whip there. Is there any point where you think, because of what members of your party are doing and saying, that you just can't do it anymore?
Well, I can't vote for the illegal migration bill, and in fact, they're voting on it this evening, and I'm not there. And that's not just because I'm here, but because I haven't voted on any stage of that bill, and I won't either. And it's partly because I think the Rwanda policy is wrong. I think that countries do have to have immigration policies, and this country's taken in hundreds of thousands of refugees. As we know, this year it's taken in hundreds of thousands of refugees, and that's right that it should do it. But I disapproved of that policy. But everyone always asks, is the policy on refugees that jumps out of this book? But there's something else that people don't ask as often, and it's interesting because it's something that you and I didn't necessarily agree on, and I think you were possibly right, but still for complicated reasons, which is it's what led me, without any question, to support the Iraq War as well. Right? So my grandfather on both sides, they didn't want to be refugees. They wanted to. My grandfather was quite happy living in Germany. He didn't want to be a refugee in Holland, and he didn't want to be a refugee here. When he dies, his funeral is in German. He has a wreath on it from the president of Germany. The German ambassador turns up.
Just in case people missed that, his funeral was here, but the language was in German.
Correct. He's British by this point. So he didn't want to be a refugee. And I have, part of my politics is about ensuring that we have a policy that, while we control immigration, does have a functioning asylum system, and that should exist around the world. And I think that calling it an invasion was despicable, actually, and I've made that clear. But then the other part of the argument is it's led me to support, sometimes wrongly, right? But it's led me to support international attempts to make sure people can live in the countries that they live in, and try to, my grandfather would still like to be living in the house on the hill they built in Herbatov Street in Ukraine. He didn't want to leave there, and they always during the correspondence, there's quite a lot of references to my grandmother and him living happily again in that, and they never did.
Let's open it up to questions. If we might have to bring up the lights, I think, so we can see you a bit better. And do we have people with microphones? We do. So there we are, that's so much better. Thank you. So keep your hand up. If we can pass the microphone to the lady here. And is there a hand up there in this side? Yes, down here. Why don't we give the microphone to this? So we'll begin here and then we'll go there. Yeah, you go first.
Thank you very much. Daniel, in the light of Dan Stone's recent book...
If you can hold the microphone a tiny bit nearer, then we'll...
Yeah. Sorry, firstly I said thank you. And then in the light of Dan Stone's recent book, is there anything in the correspondence from your family about any experiences, for ill or for good, with the local populations in the places along their journeys?
Yeah.
And just before you answer, let's see, because there was somebody else who had a hand up here. Right, let's just pass the microphone along so that you're ready to go. But Daniel,
Right,
you answer.
yes. So the answer is both. There is in testimony and in correspondence on both sides. My mother was always very pro-Dutch. And I think one of the reasons for that is that when they got the Jewish Council handed out the stars and they put the star on, they had quite a good response from quite a lot of Dutch people who were supportive. When you read the story of the reaction of the Dutch population, it's a bit more. It's certainly a bit much murkier story than that. And if you go into the Anne Frank house, you'll see there's a letter which is from a woman called Margarita Fry, who is the head teacher of Margot Frank's school, and it's a list of children of Jewish blood. Right, horrendous phrase. And she was very happy to provide that list, which included Margot Frank and also my Aunt Ruth, which you can see if you go in there. And so it's definitely a mixed picture, but there is some evidence. And then on my father's side, he was always actually very pro-Pole because of his experience after the war being part of the Polish Free Army. But when you again read of their experience in Lvov, in particular, there were 3 murders of students that took place in 1938-9, and my grandfather issues a sort of article to all Polish Jewish students, sort of saying that we shouldn't despair and that the Jewish community would stand by them. There was a massive funeral, a big protest, and so there's a fair amount about that.
And there was a question over here. Hopefully you got the microphone ready.
I
there
have.
you are, yeah.
Yes. Also, as a son of continental refugees, I wondered whether your family, or mum and dad, had something of an agenda about assimilation, in that it said whether it was, if they'd assimilated more when they were at home, would they have been less subjected to violence? Or alternatively, they were shocked that they were very assimilated and that stood them in no stead. So when they came to Britain, what was the question? How do they deal with assimilating with non-Jews in Britain, wherever they lived?
Thank you. And if you just pass the microphone 2 rows back to the lady there is ready, and Danny, you can answer that. Yeah.
So the answer to that is my parents, I think, picked up. I've just seen that my sister's here, so I wonder if she agrees with me. My parents picked up from their parents this idea that you could be a Jew and part of the population. So my grandfather did not regard German Jew as 2 phrases, but as one concept. He thought that the Jewish sensibility was part of the German sensibility and vice versa. And I think my parents, despite being in a different country and having had the experience, picked that up and passed that on to us. So it was never very kind of militant, but it was just sort of, we were part of Britain, and it was kind of, we got on with that. So one of the things that they did was to get on with their lives and they didn't want to spend a lot of time brooding and one of the parts of their life was they lived in this country now, and so we were brought up as British. And they thought that they were very proud of our Jewish identity. We are all very proud of that. It brings, a lot of joy to me, and I brought up my children in that way as well. And I'm very open about my Judaism in public life, and I hope other Jews will feel the same. But I don't regard that as non-integration. I think it's sort of part of integration.
Yeah, Dan.
Hello, is that on? Yeah, Johnny, if we've only got a limited amount of time and a limited amount of money, which of the 2 books should we buy tonight? No. And Danny, I was going to just say that your grandfather was called the Iron King. Add an L on the beginning of that, you can send it to Disney. But the question I have for you is, Johnny mentioned that you in your sense of Stalin versus Hitler, but are you writing it also with an idea in mind, with your vehemence, that in this country at the moment, I feel there's a sense that Nazism is seen as terrible, which it quite rightly was, but communism isn't particularly seen as terrible. I think communism, there's a sort of sneaky admiration in certain places. If you watch The Rise of the Nazis on the BBC, which is a very good series, you'd have thought that the communists were Cub Scouts. There's no sense of any negative, and in the sense that communists in the 20th century killed as many people, if not more, than the Nazis. Do you feel that you're trying to redress that balance a little bit?
Yeah, I guess I am. Yeah, what I'm primarily trying to do is, and this was a project. I'm trying to just tell what happened to my parents. I think when you read what happened to my parents, then this point becomes obvious. That's the way that I've written the book. You read the book, you'll find out what happened to my parents and why. So what I've tried to do is make sure that the history of why certain things, nobody will find that there's police outside their front door without you, the reader, understanding why they were there or how they got there. You won't things don't drop out of the sky. I built the history up so that you can read it to understand the history. So people don't go to Belsen and you not know what Belsen is. I'll explain it. And I explained why the communists did what they did and who they did it to. And my family story is then part of that. And yes, I think people will read it and they will not know this and it will alter them. My nephew did a program, which in many ways was great, called Rooted. This is about 20 years ago. And he was maybe a little bit more. And he was taken back to Lviv. The idea was, somebody who was from a Jamaican family, they'd go back to Jamaica. Someone from an Indian family would go back to India. And he went back to Lviv. And they told the story, and it was all about how, which is certainly true for many members of my family, the Nazis killed the Jews of Lviv. But they didn't mention the communists at all, which was in fact what had actually happened to my family. And why my family wasn't there anymore was because of the communists, not because of the Nazis. So I think it does, that is, I think, one of the things people will discover of the history of that period from reading my book. But I don't spend a lot of time theorising about that. I just tell you what's happened, and you can then see for yourself what you think of it. Yeah.
Hi, Daniel.
Hello.
Hi. I just wondered what you think your parents would have thought if they'd read the book, and whether your mum knew you were writing it or going to write it.
So I did tell my mum that I would write it, but unfortunately both of them died before I did write it. I've said that I think my mum and dad would be very proud of the book, but they'd also been proud if I hadn't written it, and they'd also been proud if I'd written it. It had been terrible. They were very nice people, and that was just what they were like. But I think they would. I think Dad would have definitely been pleased that the story of the Poles was told when it hadn't been, and Mum would have really liked a book, wouldn't she, Tamara, of published by HarperCollins, with in the Times Review and everything.
Because you mentioned that by the time you came to do it, they were no longer alive. There's a question there, which is why it took you so long. You've been writing and a journalist for quite a while.
Okay, so there are a number of reasons why. The primary one is that I was constantly in a meeting with a PhD student from the University of Sussex who wanted to ask me why John Major lost the 1997 general election, and I therefore didn't have time to write a book. And then COVID happened, and all these meetings were cancelled, and then I did have time to do it. It was something that I knew I had to do. But there's another element to it, which I feel a bit embarrassed about this, but I always knew I wanted to write a book. I felt it was something that, I looked at your amazing, prodigious output, and I thought, I ought to be able to write a book and sustain.
If he can do it.
No, but you can do it so brilliantly. I ought to be able to do it at least a little. And so it's something to really, and I also knew I wanted to tell Mum and Dad's story, but extraordinarily enough, it never occurred to me those were not, in fact, contradictory aims. And then I got an agent. I'm sure that the original reason was so that I could go to dinner parties and say my agent without actually writing anything. But then he sort of helped me sort of say, well, what are you going to write about? So we went through several subjects, and then I said, obviously there's my parents' story. And he goes, well, clearly you should write that.
But do you think emotionally, or even something deeper than that, it has to be at this stage of a life to do it? At the age 30 or 40, you wouldn't have been ready?
Yeah, I understood it better. there's something that really helps with this book, actually, which I should admit, which is the internet helped. So there's no question that I knew quite a lot of stuff, but there's a lot of times when you were able to find things out, the weather on a particular day in a particular place, or what the times of all the trains were, or obtaining books that, so my aunt and my mother had different accounts about what type of train they went to different places. And I was able to ultimately work out which of them was right, which happened to be my mum, by even though my aunt was older, just by going to the internet, working out when the trains were, and then trying to see whether I could find other people's memoirs who'd been on the same trains. And then I did find them and found which trains they were. So that was an incredible help. And I'm not sure 10 or 15 years ago I would have had that. So I think I wouldn't have written as good a book, because the thing about this book, I've tried to really discover everything that you could discover about their experience.
Yeah. Let's take a couple more if we can squeeze them in before we wrap up. Who's got a question? David, there's a hand there.
Thanks very much. Really enjoying the conversation. Danny, what I really want to know is if Chelsea are going to offer a new contract to Mason Mount. But maybe you can tell me that later.
Relevant, yeah.
I'm interested in your thoughts about Jewish people of German descent getting German citizenship. And I'm guessing from your story that you probably would be eligible if you've already got it. Yeah. And what you think of that as an issue.
Okay, so first of all, one of the things that my parents wouldn't have been interested in is the whole thing with Mason Mount. One of the things that was quite interesting to me as I grew older is that my parents obviously didn't have these teenage years at all. I'm not sure how interested they would have been anyway, but they certainly weren't interested in those
Did you
things.
say where they went on their first date?
Oh yeah, they went to the Institute of Physics exhibition. And the funny thing about that is we always used to, tomorrow you'll remember, we always used to think that was very funny, and it was very typical of Dad that he'd taken Mum on that date. But I realised only when I was writing it, as I wrote it suddenly occurred to me, do you know what? Mum never thought that was funny, or she never made a joke out of it at all. And I realised from writing about Alfred and Greta and her family life, my aunt's 10-year-old autograph book, my grandmother put a long poem from Goethe in it. And I realised that my mum probably didn't think it was that unusual. The Institute of Physics probably struck her as quite a nice place to go. Yeah, my parents, that was them, definitely. Now, the question was, German citizenship. So my wife has become a German citizen, and I have not. And this all happened before I started working absolutely full on the book. I was doing some of the early research on it. And at the time, I was very sure I didn't want to have dual citizenship because I think citizenship is a commitment. And I still think this, actually. I think citizenship is a commitment. I'm British. It didn't work out that well for us having the German citizenship the first time. They can keep it, and I'm happy with my British citizenship. Particularly having accepted a peerage, I didn't feel I felt I owed loyalty to more than one place, and I didn't want to take citizenship without offering the country which I'm taking the citizenship some bond of trust and responsibility. So I didn't do it, and that's where I still feel about it. But you cannot read this story without accepting 2 points that Nikki made to me in response, one of which was, for her it was transactional. It's not a bad idea to have more than one piece of paper. You never know when you might need it. Your grandfather didn't have this, and maybe it would have been better if he'd had two, right? And you read it and think, maybe that's actually not a bad point. And then the other thing that she said is that my grandfather had wanted to be German, and I could reclaim it for him despite the way that I felt about it. So like a lot of things, there are arguments that go in both ways, but I still feel comfortable with my decision not to do that. I think it's, I'm British and I owe a lot to this country. We were able to come and settle in this country very nicely and have been very happy as a part of this nation, and I don't really feel I want to have my loyalties split with somewhere else.
The book is Hitler, Stalin, Mum and Dad, a family memoir of miraculous survival. It is a great act of love by a son to his parents. It enables, in a way, for them to live again on the pages of this book. It is a magnificent read. I'm sure you're going to want to join me in thanking its author, Daniel Finkelstein.
Thanks, that was brilliant. Amazing. You want to tell them that we're going to... he's going to tell them that.
Jonathan, Daniel, thank you. That was incredible, as always. 3 things that you all need to do now. You can do any combination of all 3. Number 1, if you'd like to get your book signed, or if you haven't bought one, there are a small number of copies left. Then Daniel has very kindly offered to stay behind. There are a few copies of Jonathan's book left there as well. So if you haven't got that yet, I highly, highly recommend it. So the books will be there. The orderly queue in a moment, don't knock me off the stage, will be over here. If we could ask you, because they've given us a lovely nearly an hour and a half of their time, and I'd rather them not have to be sitting there for another 3 hours whilst everybody tells them their personal story of when they met them at their granddaughter's bar mitzvah. So they're too polite to ask that, so I'm going to say that on their behalf, if we could keep the queue moving, and it saves the people at the end having to wait too long. The second thing is, you can see both these wonderful friends of ours every day at JW3 in the wonderful exhibition upstairs, Zoom Rockman's Jewish Hall of Fame. And the brilliant, talented artist Zoom Rockman is in the audience tonight. So he's going to make sure that we nab you both. And I'm biased on that one, but I really recommend that you get tickets to come and see that show at some point. And thirdly, if you have got your book signed and if you're ready to go, there's a cafe outside. Please carry on the conversation that Jonathan Daniel started tonight. Don't let that conversation end. Go and grab a drink, go and sit outside, it's nice and warm, and carry on the conversation with people you know and came with, or people that you only met this evening. So thank you both, and thank you the audience at home and in the room.